The sky was overcast, thick with dark clouds that seemed to weigh heavily over the small town in the Midwest. The air was chilly, adding a somber tone as friends and family gathered for Helen's funeral. The ceremony was held in a modest, decades-old cemetery on the outskirts of town, where rows of simple, weather-worn headstones stood as silent witnesses to countless farewells. The crowd, dressed in muted tones of black and gray, huddled together against the crisp wind, sharing quiet words and solemn glances as they braced for the service. Near the edge of the gathering stood Buddy, Helen's loyal golden retriever, tethered to a small post but restless, his expressive eyes flicking between the people and the casket. Buddy had been Helen's steadfast companion for years, a familiar sight at her side whether she was shopping at the local market or volunteering at the church. Now, without her, he looked lost, shifting uneasily, his soft whine barely audible but heartbreaking to those nearby. As the Reverend, a tall, middle-aged man with silvering hair and a serious gaze, began his eulogy, Buddy's restlessness grew. Revered Mike spoke in calm, measured tones, offering the comfort of words familiar in times of grief. Helen was a kind soul, he began, his voice smooth but devoid of warmth, a woman of unwavering faith and generosity. She touched us all. His words seemed rehearsed, polished. But for many, including Buddy, there was an undercurrent, a sense that something was missing, or perhaps that something was wrong. Out of nowhere, Buddy started to bark. At first, it was just a single, sharp yelp that made everyone pause. But soon, it grew louder, persistent, aimed directly at the closed casket. Heads turned, eyes widening in surprise. Some of the guests gasped. A few exchanged uncomfortable looks. "Buddy, quiet," a family friend whispered, pulling on his leash, but Buddy wouldn't stop, his barks becoming desperate, urgent, almost pleading. Reverend Mike's face paled slightly, and he cleared his throat, shifting nervously as he tried to regain control. "Let us remember Helen in peace," he murmured, his hands clenching the sides of his Bible as if trying to anchor himself. Buddy's barking continued, relentless, filling the silence that followed Mike's words with an eerie intensity. A young man, standing at the back, narrowed his eyes, studying Buddy and then the Reverend with a look of concern. This stranger, who had introduced himself as Jack, seemed as disturbed by Buddy's reaction as he was intrigued by the Reverend's response. It was as if Buddy knew something the Reverend wished he wouldn't reveal. As Buddy's barks reverberated through the air, an uncomfortable chill settled over the mourners, leaving them with a sense that Helen's story was far from over. Jack wasn't a familiar face in this small town. He had arrived just a week prior, staying in a rented room above the local diner, keeping mostly to himself, with rugged features softened only by his piercing blue eyes. Jack had the look of someone who had seen too much of life's hardships, someone who carried his own set of burdens. Dressed in a worn leather jacket and jeans, he didn't fit the mold of the town's residents, who were mostly families and older folks with roots going back generations. People noticed him, but, respecting his silence, they left him alone. He hadn't planned on attending Helen's funeral. He didn't even know her, but he'd heard about her passing while having coffee at the diner that morning. Something in the quiet sorrow of the townsfolk had stirred him, and curiosity, or perhaps loneliness, had led him to the cemetery. Now, he found himself watching the strange scene unfolding before him with a growing sense of intrigue. Buddy's barking hadn't stopped. The dog's fur was bristling, his eyes fixed on the casket with a focus that seemed almost human. The intensity of Buddy's reaction made Jack uneasy. He looked around, gauging the expressions of the mourners, who shifted uncomfortably, their faces a mixture of sadness and confusion. But it was Reverend Mike who drew Jack's attention. The Reverend, usually calm and composed, was visibly disturbed, his eyes darting nervously between the barking dog and the crowd. Jack stepped closer to the Reverend, lowering his voice so only Mike could hear. "Seems like the dog's trying to tell us something," he said, his voice laced with an edge of suspicion. The Reverend glanced at him, his face tightening. "Dogs don't know grief the way we do," Mike replied tersely, a faint tremor in his voice. "He's just confused without Helen." Jack raised an eyebrow, his gaze piercing. "Maybe. Or maybe there's more to this than just confusion. Mike's eyes flickered, his grip on the Bible tightening. I'd suggest you keep your theories to yourself, he muttered, trying to maintain control, his polite tone barely masking a hint of irritation. But Jack wasn't one to let things slide easily. He turned to Buddy, squatting down to meet the dog's gaze. "Hey, boy," he murmured softly, holding out his hand. Buddy sniffed it briefly, then looked back toward the casket, a low, mournful whine escaping him. It was as if the dog was trying to communicate, but words failed him, leaving only the raw emotion in his eyes. Turning back to Mike, Jack noted the beads of sweat forming on the Reverend's brow. "Strange how some folks react to grief," he said pointedly, watching as Mike visibly flinched. It was becoming clear to Jack that Buddy's behavior was more than just an animal's confusion. The dog's instincts were keen, and whatever he was sensing, it was unsettling enough to shake the Reverend's composure. As the last prayer was said and the crowd began to disperse, Jack lingered, his thoughts churning. There was something here, something that wasn't right, and he intended to find out exactly what it was. Even if it meant stirring up ghosts some people would rather leave buried. The funeral had ended, but the unease lingered like a shadow over the cemetery. As the mourners drifted away, Reverend Mike busied himself gathering his notes, but Jack's gaze stayed firmly on him. There was something off about the Reverend's reactions, a subtle discomfort that didn't seem to come solely from the grief of losing a church member. Jack had seen men react this way before, back when he worked as a private investigator in Chicago. It was the look of someone with something to hide. Buddy, still uneasy, remained close to Jack, his tail low and ears perked, his sharp eyes following every move of the Reverend. Jack gave the dog a reassuring scratch behind the ears, then took a few steps closer to Mike, who stiffened as Jack approached. "Reverend," Jack began, keeping his tone casual, "I noticed you seemed a bit unsettled back there. Anything you want to share?" Mike forced a thin smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "It's a difficult day for all of us," he replied, voice tight. "Helen was a dear member of our community, and her passing, well, it's hard for everyone." "Sure," Jack replied slowly, nodding. "But I couldn't help but notice that Buddy's reaction got to you. Looked like you were a little more nervous than grieving." The Reverend's face flushed, a brief flicker of irritation crossing his features. "I don't know what you're implying, but I can assure you, I have nothing but respect for Helen's memory," he said defensively, his voice growing sharper. He cleared his throat and added in a more controlled tone, "Sometimes animals sense things that aren't there. Buddy's just adjusting, that's all." Jack's eyes narrowed slightly as he watched Mike's reaction. It was classic deflection, dismissing the incident rather than addressing it directly. "Funny," Jack murmured, his gaze unwavering. "I've known dogs to be pretty sharp about people's intentions, and I get the feeling Buddy's onto something." Mike let out a strained chuckle. "Mr. Jack, was it?" he asked, his tone icy. "I appreciate that you're new in town, but some things are better left to those who've known each other for years. Helen was a private person. We should respect her memory by letting her rest in peace." "Sure thing, Reverend," Jack replied, his tone equally cool. "I just have a hard time ignoring a dog like Buddy. Animals have a way of picking up on things people miss." He shrugged nonchalantly. "Guess it's a habit from my old line of work." Jack saw the color drain slightly from Mike's face as the words sank in. It was subtle, but the Reverend's fingers twitched nervously, as if fighting the urge to check his watch or glance around. Jack filed this reaction away in his mind, knowing he'd hit a nerve. Whatever Reverend Mike was hiding, Buddy's barking had struck close to the mark. With the funeral service now over and the crowd dwindling, Mike muttered an awkward goodbye and turned quickly, retreating toward his car. Jack watched him go, feeling the familiar buzz of curiosity and suspicion. Buddy seemed to sense it too, looking up at Jack with eyes that seemed to plead for justice. Patting Buddy's head, Jack muttered to himself, "Looks like we've got some work to do, boy." As they walked back toward town, Jack's mind began to race with questions. Who exactly was Helen to the Reverend? And why did he seem so nervous? Jack knew he'd have to dig deeper, and with Buddy's help, he was determined to uncover the truth about Reverend Mike, even if that meant facing secrets that others had tried hard to bury. Jack couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was wrong. His instincts, honed from years of private investigation, told him that Reverend Mike wasn't just mourning Helen. He was hiding something. The strange tension, Buddy's reaction, and the Reverend's defensive responses all pointed to a deeper mystery. Jack decided that if he was going to get to the bottom of it, he'd need to start digging. The following day, Jack set out on a walk with Buddy, intending to retrace Helen's last steps in town. Helen had been a quiet woman, mostly keeping to herself, but she was known for her kind heart and community involvement. She had volunteered at the local church, where she and Reverend Mike had worked closely together. Jack knew that if there were secrets, they were likely buried somewhere in her routine. They began at Helen's modest home, a small, single-story house with peeling paint and a neglected garden. Jack pushed open the gate, glancing down at Buddy, who seemed alert, sniffing the ground and wagging his tail slightly. "Let's see what you can find, boy," Jack murmured, and Buddy immediately trotted toward the back of the house, nose to the ground. In the backyard, Jack noticed a small shed tucked away behind some overgrown shrubs. The door was slightly ajar, creaking softly in the breeze. He stepped inside, taking in the faint smell of dust and old wood. Boxes lined the shelves, filled with everyday items, but one box stood out, a small, unmarked one that seemed newer than the others. Inside, Jack found a few trinkets and a small notebook bound in blue leather. The first page read simply, "Helen's Journal." As he flipped through the pages, Jack's eyes widened. Helen had written about her suspicions, her careful observations of the Reverend's behavior. She noted his frequent meetings with strangers late at night, often in secluded areas around town, and mentioned overhearing conversations about funds and donations. One entry caught Jack's attention in particular. "I don't know if I should trust him. He says the money is going to help the community, but I see no changes. And now he's asking me to keep records in his office, away from prying eyes." Jack's grip tightened on the notebook. Helen's words painted a troubling picture of a man hiding something significant and potentially dangerous. This was more than a simple distrust. Helen had clearly felt threatened. Buddy, sensing Jack's tension, gave a soft whine, nudging his leg with a wet nose. "Good boy," Jack murmured, giving Buddy a reassuring pat. "We're onto something. I can feel it." As they left Helen's house, Jack's mind spun with possibilities. His next stop would have to be the church. Whatever Reverend Mike was hiding, he was certain the church held more answers. Jack made a mental note of Helen's observations, hoping they would guide him to the truth. The peaceful town seemed to harbor secrets far darker than its quiet exterior suggested. That night, as he prepared for the next step in his investigation, Jack whispered to Buddy, "Tomorrow, we're going to find out exactly what Reverend Mike didn't want Helen to see." The dog responded with a steady gaze, as if he, too, was ready to uncover the truth. The next morning, Jack and Buddy headed for the woods, where Helen's journal had mentioned an abandoned cabin. It was a place she visited often, a quiet retreat where she seemed to feel safe enough to record her most private thoughts. Jack had a hunch that if Helen had left more clues, they'd be hidden there. The cabin was well off the beaten path, nestled within a thick grove of trees and nearly camouflaged by the underbrush. As Jack approached, he noticed the worn wood and broken windows, signs of long neglect. Buddy trotted ahead, sniffing at the ground and occasionally glancing back, his eyes bright with purpose. Jack couldn't help but feel a surge of gratitude for the dog's company. They were a team now, and he trusted Buddy's instincts as much as his own. Inside the cabin, beams of light filtered through cracks in the walls, illuminating dust motes that floated lazily in the air. The silence was profound, broken only by Buddy's soft sniffs as he explored. In the corner, Jack spotted a wooden chest, the lid slightly ajar. When he opened it, he found a stack of old blankets and, beneath them, a small leather-bound book, the rest of Helen's diary. Jack settled onto an old chair and began reading, feeling a chill as he flipped through the pages. Helen had documented months of suspicions about Reverend Mike. She wrote about his charisma and his sway over the congregation, how he seemed trustworthy at first but slowly showed signs of something darker. It started with little things, Helen had written: missing funds, odd hours at the church, meetings with people I didn't recognize. He assured me they were for the good of the community, but I saw no benefits, only growing fear. As Jack read on, a passage caught his eye, the words underlined in dark ink. I've seen him with people who don't belong in this town, men in expensive suits who only come at night. I overheard them talking about hiding the money. He said if I told anyone, it would ruin everything he'd worked for. Helen had continued, I can't stay silent, but I don't know who to trust. If anyone finds this, please, don't let him hurt anyone else. Jack's heart pounded as he took in Helen's words. She had known too much, and perhaps that knowledge had ultimately put her life in danger. He clenched the diary tightly, his jaw set. Whatever Reverend Mike was hiding, Helen had paid the price for trying to uncover it. As Jack closed the diary, he looked down at Buddy, who was watching him intently, as if sensing the gravity of the moment. Well, boy, he said softly, looks like Helen was onto something big, and we're not stopping until we find out exactly what. Leaving the cabin, Jack felt a renewed sense of purpose. Armed with Helen's diary and Buddy's unwavering loyalty, he was more determined than ever to expose Reverend Mike's secrets. Whatever lay ahead, he knew he wasn't alone in this fight. Jack's mind raced as he and Buddy returned from the cabin. The revelations in Helen's diary painted a chilling picture of Reverend Mike, one that didn't fit the respected figure who led Sunday services and counseled the townspeople. Helen had suspected him of far more than just questionable financial practices. She had hinted at something darker, something that had driven her to seek refuge in an isolated cabin to record her fears. That evening, Jack decided to investigate the church itself. The building, a modest structure with stained glass windows and white clapboard siding, was usually quiet after hours. Jack waited until nightfall, hoping that any late visitors would have come and gone. The church grounds were empty and still, illuminated only by a dim streetlight casting long shadows across the lawn. With Buddy at his side, Jack slipped around to the back entrance, finding it unlocked, a small mercy, as he hadn't yet figured out how to pick the lock quietly. Once inside, Jack felt a strange, heavy stillness. The pews, bathed in the soft glow of moonlight streaming through the stained glass, were empty, creating an almost eerie calm. Buddy walked close to his side, his ears perked and alert, sensing the tension in Jack's movements. Jack's eyes scanned the room until they landed on the small office door to the right of the altar, the place where Reverend Mike handled church matters. The office was cramped, filled with paperwork and filing cabinets. Jack flipped through the papers on the desk, most of them routine records, sermon notes, church donations, and administrative documents. But something felt off. The donation records seemed oddly inconsistent. Each entry for donations was neat and precise, but large sums were often marked with vague designations like Community Fund and Special Project without any supporting documentation. Just as he was about to give up, Buddy let out a low growl, his attention focused on a drawer at the bottom of the desk. Curious, Jack opened it, finding a small locked box inside. He fished through the Reverend's desk for a key, but nothing fit. Frustrated, he set it aside and kept searching. That's when Buddy's nose pressed against something on the floor, a small, glinting object half hidden by the desk leg. Jack reached down, picking up a tiny silver key. He glanced at Buddy, whose eyes gleamed with excitement, as if he knew they were onto something important. Good boy, Jack whispered, giving him a pat before sliding the key into the lock on the box. Inside were stacks of cash and documents, bank statements, transaction records, and letters with signatures Jack didn't recognize. As he read through them, his stomach churned. These documents detailed transactions involving church funds, routed through personal accounts, and then disappearing into shell organizations. The sums were far beyond what would ever be needed for church repairs or community projects. It was clear Reverend Mike was siphoning money for personal gain, disguising it under layers of paperwork that would go unnoticed by the average congregant. Jack took photos of the documents with his phone, ensuring he'd have proof even if the originals were destroyed. As he snapped the last picture, he heard footsteps in the hallway. His heart pounded as he quickly shoved the documents back into the box, locking it and returning the key to the floor where Buddy had found it. Just as the footsteps stopped outside the office, Jack crouched behind the desk, motioning for Buddy to stay quiet. The door creaked open, and Reverend Mike stepped inside. He flipped on the light, his eyes narrowing as he glanced around, sensing something was off. Jack held his breath, gripping Buddy's collar gently to keep him still. After a tense moment, the Reverend shrugged, muttering to himself, "Just nerves." He turned off the light and left, the sound of his footsteps fading down the hall. Jack exhaled slowly, waiting a few moments before rising from his hiding spot. He and Buddy slipped out of the church, adrenaline coursing through his veins. Now he had the evidence to expose Reverend Mike's corruption. But he knew that confronting the Reverend would be dangerous, especially since the man was willing to go to any length to keep his secrets buried. As they walked back through the empty streets, Jack looked down at Buddy, who seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. "We're close, boy," Jack whispered. "But this isn't over yet." The next night, Jack knew it was time to confront Reverend Mike. Armed with the photographs he'd taken of the documents, he felt a grim resolve. This wouldn't be an easy conversation, but if he was going to expose Mike's corruption, it had to be done face to face. He knew the risks. A man as secretive and powerful as the Reverend wouldn't take kindly to being cornered. But Jack couldn't turn away from the truth, not after everything Helen had endured. He made his way to the church under the cover of darkness, Buddy trotting faithfully by his side. Jack had left a note for Mike, requesting a private meeting to discuss church matters. Mike's response had been a terse agreement to meet him that night. The church loomed in the dim glow of the street lamps, its stained glass windows casting an ominous glow. Jack took a steadying breath, tightening his grip on Buddy's leash as he entered. Mike was already waiting for him inside the sanctuary, standing by the altar with his arms crossed. The usual calm, almost grandfatherly demeanor was gone. Instead, his face was set in a hard line, his eyes cold and calculating. "Jack," he greeted, his voice clipped. This meeting was rather unexpected. "What exactly is so urgent?" Jack didn't waste time. He reached into his jacket, pulling out his phone and displaying one of the photos he'd taken of the financial documents. "I think you know exactly why I'm here, Reverend," he said, his voice steady. "Helen's journal, your financial records, the money funneled through personal accounts. I know you've been stealing from this town." Mike's face darkened, his lips pressing into a thin line. "You have no idea what you're talking about," he hissed. "You come into this town, you don't know anything about its people, about what's at stake. Who are you to judge me?" "I know enough," Jack replied, his tone unyielding. "Helen trusted you. She saw the kind of person you were becoming, and you let her down. You betrayed this entire town, Mike, all for greed." The Reverend's composure finally cracked, a flash of anger crossing his face. "You think you're some kind of hero?" he sneered, stepping closer, his fists clenched. "Helen was a naive fool, always prying into things that didn't concern her. And now, you're making the same mistake. People like me, people who keep this town running, we're the ones who make the hard choices, not meddling strangers like you." Buddy growled softly, sensing the tension. Jack kept a hand on his collar, but his own anger flared. "You used the church, the people's trust, to line your own pockets. There's nothing noble about what you've done." Suddenly, Reverend Mike lunged, trying to grab the phone from Jack's hand. The two men grappled, their struggle crashing into the pews and echoing through the empty sanctuary. Jack fought to hold his ground, but Mike was surprisingly strong, his desperation fueling his strength. Buddy leapt forward, barking fiercely, nipping at Mike's leg and giving Jack just enough time to break free. As they stumbled apart, Jack heard voices outside. The commotion had drawn the attention of a few townsfolk who'd come to investigate the noise. One by one, they filtered into the church, their eyes widening as they took in the scene. Their trusted Reverend, disheveled and wild-eyed, standing toe-to-toe with Jack. "What's going on here?" one of the townspeople asked, her voice shaking. Jack raised his phone, showing the gathered crowd the photos of Mike's financial records. "This man has been stealing from the church," he said, his voice ringing out clearly. "He's been taking donations meant for the community, and he's been hiding it right here." A murmur of shock rippled through the crowd as they absorbed the news. Reverend Mike tried to speak, his voice a desperate plea. "These are lies," he shouted, but his face betrayed him, and the trust of the people began to crumble right before his eyes. Jack, catching his breath, took a step back. "It's over, Mike," he said quietly. "This town deserves better than a leader who deceived them." As the townsfolk gathered closer, the weight of the revelation set in, and Jack knew that the Reverend's hold on them had finally shattered. Buddy sat at his side, panting but proud, as if he, too, understood the victory they'd achieved. The tension in the church was palpable as the townsfolk continued to gather, murmurs of disbelief mixing with anger as they digested the betrayal that Jack had exposed. Reverend Mike's face was flushed, his fists clenching and unclenching as he struggled to maintain control. For a moment, Jack thought the Reverend might try to reason with the crowd, to spin the narrative and talk his way out. But instead, something darker flickered across Mike's expression, an emotion that looked more like rage than regret. Jack barely had time to react as Mike lunged at him once again, desperation turning his movements erratic but forceful. The Reverend's weight crashed into Jack, sending them both sprawling onto the cold, hard floor between the pews. Buddy barked furiously, his growls echoing through the sanctuary as he darted in, ready to defend Jack. The crowd gasped, some stepping forward to help, others too stunned to move. "Enough!" Mike snarled, his face inches from Jack's, his voice a low, threatening growl. "You have no idea what I've sacrificed for this place. I built this community, kept it alive, while people like you come and go without understanding the burden." Jack managed to shove him back, breathing heavily as he got to his feet. "Sacrifice?" He shot back, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "You exploited this town, Mike. You took people's trust and twisted it for your own gain. That's not sacrifice. That's corruption." The Reverend's face twisted with fury. He threw a wild punch, but Jack sidestepped, grabbing his arm and twisting it back. "Your lies end here," Jack said through gritted teeth, his hold firm as he forced Mike down onto his knees. Buddy, ever vigilant, circled the Reverend, growling low as if to reinforce the warning. The townspeople began to close in, a few brave souls stepping forward with hard expressions. One of the elders of the church, a frail but determined woman named Martha, looked at Mike with tears in her eyes. "You were supposed to help us, Mike," she whispered, her voice wavering. "We trusted you." Reverend Mike looked around at the faces of the people he'd betrayed, his shoulders slumping as the weight of their disapproval finally sank in. His defiance seemed to drain away, leaving him looking small and defeated. Jack released him, and the Reverend crumpled onto the floor, no longer the commanding figure he had been. Sheriff Collins, who had arrived during the commotion, stepped forward. He gave Jack a nod, then addressed the townsfolk. "We'll handle it from here," he said, his voice somber. He placed a firm hand on Mike's shoulder, preparing to lead him out. As he passed Jack, he paused. "Thank you, Jack. For Helen, and for all of us." Jack nodded silently, watching as the Reverend was escorted out of the church, his head hanging low. The weight of the truth had finally caught up with him, and there was no escaping the consequences. As the crowd dispersed, some people approached Jack, offering quiet thanks, their faces a mixture of relief and sorrow. Jack felt Buddy press against his leg, a reassuring presence in the aftermath of the confrontation. Together, they had brought the truth to light, but it was a bittersweet victory. Lives had been shaken, trust broken, but in the end, justice had prevailed. The following Sunday, the church was filled again, but the usual feeling of peace and reverence was replaced by a mix of emotions: sadness, betrayal, relief, and a glimmer of hope. Word of Reverend Mike's arrest had spread quickly, and the congregation had gathered to hear the full story, to finally understand what had been hidden in the shadows for so long. Jack stood near the back of the sanctuary, quietly observing as people took their seats, their expressions solemn. Buddy sat obediently at his side, earning gentle pats and appreciative smiles from those who recognized him as the dog who had first sounded the alarm. The townsfolk had come to see Buddy as a hero, and in their eyes, Jack was no different. But Jack remained humble, knowing he'd only been the vessel for Helen's truth to come to light. Sheriff Collins stepped up to the pulpit, the same spot where Reverend Mike had once spoken so confidently. He cleared his throat, looking over the faces of the congregation, and took a deep breath before addressing them. "I know this past week has been difficult for all of us," he began, his voice steady but compassionate. Reverend Mike was someone we trusted, someone who held a special place in our community. But we've learned that trust was misused. Thanks to the courage of Helen and the persistence of our new friend Jack, we now know the truth. A murmur rippled through the crowd as Collins continued. "The funds you donated in good faith were diverted for personal gain, hidden behind the guise of community service. It's a hard truth to swallow, and I know many of you feel angry and betrayed. But let us remember that it's our community that defines us, not the actions of one man." Jack felt a wave of emotion as he listened. He hadn't come here to be recognized or praised, but seeing the strength in these people's faces, he understood the impact of what had been done. Martha, the elderly woman who had confronted Reverend Mike, rose from her seat, her frail voice cutting through the silence. "Helen wanted us to know," she said, her eyes brimming with tears. "She wanted us to have a chance to rebuild, to find a leader who truly cares for us. And now we have that chance." The crowd nodded, some wiping away tears, others hugging those beside them. Jack felt a warmth spreading through him, a sense of purpose that had been absent from his life for a long time. He hadn't expected to stay in this town, but now, as he looked at the faces of people who had come together despite the betrayal, he realized he'd found something he hadn't even known he was searching for: a sense of belonging. Sheriff Collins gestured for Jack to come forward, and reluctantly, he stepped up, Buddy following close behind. "Jack," the sheriff said, placing a hand on his shoulder, "you've shown us the courage it takes to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. This town owes you a debt of gratitude." Jack looked out at the congregation, his voice low but clear. "I didn't come here looking for recognition," he said, glancing down at Buddy, who gazed up at him loyally. "Helen's the real hero here. She cared enough about this town to risk everything to protect it. I just helped finish what she started." The crowd erupted in quiet applause, a gentle but heartfelt show of appreciation. As the people rose to leave, many approached Jack to shake his hand or thank him, each one offering words of gratitude that he accepted humbly. As the sanctuary emptied, Jack felt a sense of peace settle over him. The darkness Reverend Mike had cast over the town had lifted, and a new beginning lay ahead. Jack knew that he'd found a place he could finally call home, a town where he and Buddy could find not just rest, but a future. In the weeks that followed, the town felt like it was breathing fresh air for the first time in years. With Reverend Mike now facing trial, the townsfolk began the process of healing, looking for ways to rebuild the trust that had been shattered. Community meetings were held, where people shared their thoughts, voiced their fears, and talked openly about the path forward. Jack, though he had initially intended to stay only a short time, found himself becoming a central part of these conversations. His insights, along with his genuine concern for the town's future, earned him the respect of the townsfolk. Jack had rented a small house just off Main Street, and each day Buddy could be seen trotting beside him as he walked through town. Children stopped to pet Buddy, and shop owners greeted Jack warmly, often asking for his advice on various matters. It was a new feeling for him, this sense of community and purpose, and he welcomed it. One sunny afternoon, the town held a gathering at the church. This time, it wasn't a service, but rather a celebration. A day to honor Helen's memory and her bravery in standing up for the truth. Martha, the elder who had spoken out during Mike's confrontation, organized a small ceremony to recognize Helen's contributions and to formally thank Jack and Buddy for their role in uncovering the truth. Standing in front of the crowd, Jack felt a surge of emotion as Martha spoke. "Helen was the kind of person who gave without expecting anything in return," she said, her voice steady. "She believed in us, in the goodness of this town, and because of her, we've been given a chance to start anew." She turned to Jack, her eyes warm. "And to Jack and to Buddy, we can't thank you enough for reminding us what courage looks like." The crowd cheered, clapping for Jack and Buddy. Feeling a bit bashful, Jack stepped forward, scratching Buddy behind the ears as he looked out at the townsfolk. I think Helen's bravery will be a part of this town forever, he said, his voice filled with quiet sincerity. All Buddy and I did was follow her lead. I'm grateful to be a part of this town, and I look forward to seeing what we can build together. As the crowd applauded, Jack felt a hand on his shoulder. Turning, he saw Sheriff Collins, who gave him a nod of approval. You're one of us now, Jack, the sheriff said, his voice gruff but warm. And if you ever need a friend, you know where to find me. Later, as the sun began to set over the town, Jack and Buddy took a quiet walk along the familiar streets. The town had found new leadership, people who genuinely cared for its future, and Jack knew he had finally found a place he could call home. Buddy trotted happily beside him, his tail wagging as he sniffed the air, content in the knowledge that he, too, had played a part in bringing peace to the place they both now belonged. Together, they had found a new beginning, a life where purpose, community, and the memory of a woman's courage would forever shape the town's future. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and check out this next story. It's incredibly moving.